All right, the Tom Benty Media Podcast. This is the Thomas Alva Edison series. This is episode number 3, and it's entitled A Life of Work. And as I've mentioned before, Edison was all about his work. He was solely focused on his goals, his career goals, and getting better and improving. And he always had the end goal in mind, whether it be with the light bulb or the motion picture, etc. But his life was definitely a life of work. And in this episode, Dr. Paul Israel talks about various subjects, including why Menlo Park, New Jersey was a great location for his laboratory. And I thought that was interesting because most of the things that Dr. Israel mentions in terms of its location to the train, its location to Manhattan, is still present today. I think that during Edison's time, obviously, it was actually considered more of a farm area. And Edison, even after he left Menlo Park and went into Manhattan before going to West Orange, he used his his Menlo Park laboratory as a summer vacation home because it was much well suited for the summer weather than downtown New York, which I thought was interesting. We really don't think of Edison as a summer location, or Menlo Park rather as a summer location, but back in those days in the late 1800s, I guess it was. But it was a great location, and I think we should think about that, right? This is a new world post-COVID. A lot of people are going to different places. Some people are moving out of cities and moving to more rural areas, and with technology that we have now, we're able to do that more conveniently than ever before. So thinking about where you want to set up shop and where you want to be, I think is really important from a career standpoint, also from a personal standpoint. If you don't have to be in the city, if you don't want to be in the city, if you have a very active outdoor lifestyle and you want to be more in a location that is more conducive for that, these are the things that we have to consider. And we have the technology to do that. So having a good location, just like in Edison's time when he picked Menlo Park, I think is really important. We talk in this episode also about the motion picture. So I'm a filmmaker, as everybody knows, and this is obviously very interesting for me. And Edison was a big part of creating the film industry overall. But before film industry was in Hollywood, it was actually in Fort Lee, New Jersey. They had a lot of big productions, and Edison was a big part of that. And he created the first camera, the motion picture camera, to do that. And what's interesting is that as a genius as Edison was, he didn't see motion pictures as an art form. And he saw it as just kind of like this novelty thing that people would go into different. I think there was an actual, and we don't talk about in this episode, but I saw a documentary that referenced it. And before there was theaters, there was actually little places you can go into, and one was in Manhattan, and you can go and you can look at these little box devices and you can see kind of these different showcases of film, of people doing dances and muscle men, etc. And I don't think Edison, as a genius as he was, he didn't see beyond that. He didn't see how this is going to transform the way that we tell stories and that the way that we communicate as a humanity and as a culture. It wasn't until later on that movies were showcased in theaters that he understood the value, the cultural and artistic value of movies. And of course, he was a part of the Great Train Robbery, which is a very famous early film that he was a part of. I think he produced it with another gentleman, and I think William Dixon was his name. And that was one of the first showcases of, hey, that this is more than just pictures, moving pictures. This is actually a way of communication. This is a way of telling stories, which I thought kind of showcased the potential at that point. But early on, he did not see that, which I thought was interesting because he's so prolific in all aspects of his life. Also, Edison was very concerned about his name, and he was someone who understood the power of the media. I think from the first episode, we talk about Edison, and he was early on in his life, he was selling newspapers when he was a little boy. And from that point on, he really understood how powerful communication was, how powerful the media was. And he was someone that used that to his advantage. And he would, despite him not being such a social animal as going to parties, I don't think he drank. He was not into, socializing and going to different events and galas, etc. But he was really good with reporters one-on-one, and he understood the power and the necessity of using that medium to really get his name across. And he was very concerned with his name. A lot of people that were associated with him were overshadowed by Edison, even if they, there's some controversy on today with in terms of his actual contributions. And some people feel that he doesn't deserve all the credit that he gets because he had some really great people working for him. But Edison was not someone to really share credit. He was someone who really wanted that name recognition, and he held on to that through much of his life. Just some great lessons for today. I mean, branding from a personal standpoint, we're still concerned with personal branding. How you present yourself on social media is very important. How you present yourself in the world is very important to your personal brand, which is a big part of who you are. Edison was not just an inventor. He was an actual personality. He was one of the first celebrities of the day who pretty much everyone knew him. He would travel all over the world, all over the country, and people knew who he was, and they flocked to him because of that name recognition he got from the media. So just another great lesson for today in terms of our personal brand. What do we want to showcase? How do we want to reflect? We have a lot of power today. We can do that, and we have control over that. Whereas before, you had to have the status of a Thomas Edison to really get your name across. But now we have social media. And the question is, how do we want to really showcase ourselves on social media? And we should be strategic with it. We should be, it should be genuine, but it should be something that highlights us in the best way possible. Especially if you're an entrepreneur, if you're someone who's a creative leader, as I like to call you, a lot of people out there, be mindful of what you put on social media. Showcase yourself in a good light, and make it honest and make it genuine, because we can definitely tell when it's not. So I think that's a really great lesson, is that our personal branding is very important, and how we showcase that is going to help us in our career, also in our personal lives. So that was a really interesting lesson from this episode. As well. So yeah, we got a couple more coming up. This is, I'm really enjoying and I'm very interested in all that goes into this. It's been a really great experience to learn about Thomas Edison and his time in Menlo Park, which, hey, I grew up in Edison, and it's right there, and you don't think of it, but what happened in Edison really just changed the world. What happened at Menlo Park, it changed the world. Christie Street, which is right in Edison, was the first street to be lit up by Thomas Edison's invention back, I think, in New Year's Eve, 1879, and the whole world kind of flocked to Edison to witness that, and that was the start of a brand new way of living for humanity. So really some interesting stuff, and I hope you get a lot out of it. There's a couple more episodes coming up. Please stay tuned, and if you have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to hear from you. But so this is episode number 3, Tom Benty Media, the Thomas Alva Edison series, episode number 3. Like I said, A Life of Work, featuring Dr. Paul Israel of the Edison Papers from Rutgers University. So stay well, and I'll talk to you soon.
So Menlo Park, the reason that Harrison was a much better place to find cheap workers is that Menlo Park was essentially surrounded by farmland. The small town of Metuchen was nearby. You were on the railroad to Newark and New York, and also further south to Trenton and Philadelphia, but you're not going to find cheaper labor that has to get on a train and come out to Menlo Park, right? And there aren't enough people looking for factory work in the area around Menlo Park. So by moving up to the Newark and Harrison area, all of a sudden there's a plentiful workforce, and that enables Edison to have a much cheaper workforce. I mean, this is, the economics of manufacturing, right? We still face that today. So one of the reasons Edison chose Menlo Park is that it was, Menlo Park is pretty close to Newark. It's about 12 miles, I think. And then at that time, there was no tunnel across the river on the railroad into New York, but you could take a ferry across, right? And so you took a train to Hoboken, where the ferries were, or you could take a train to Newark, and then you could go down to Philadelphia very readily as well. And so Edison had this central location to all of these places, but here he was in a much more pristine environment, healthier for his family. In fact, after Edison and his family move into New York in 1881, so he can supervise all the work that's going on, they still use Menlo Park as their summer home because it's a lot more pleasant at Menlo Park in the summer than it is in downtown New York, obviously. So Edison, I would say Edison's primary focus in life was his inventive activities. And I think this was something that his first wife understood. After she married him, he spent a lot of time in the laboratory. And she probably grew frustrated sometimes. There's even a story told about him coming home, going down the hill to home from the laboratory at Menlo Park, and just kind of flopping on the bed in his dirty work clothes, right? Which I'm sure frustrated her. She was more of a social animal than Edison was. Edison wasn't a big one for socializing. He loved to tell stories and was very good one-on-one with reporters and with the workmen, very much masculine atmosphere of the laboratory. That's where Edison enjoyed himself. At home, where things were a little bit more formal, especially if there were dinner parties, that wasn't really Edison's thing. And he, I think, sometimes found a good excuse not to participate because he was hard of hearing. He began to have hearing loss as a boy. There are different stories about that, but it appears to be a degenerative disease that he had in his ear, and over time he lost his hearing. So that by the 20s, I mean, basically you had to stand up right close to him and basically he cupped his ear and you yelled into it and he could make out what you were saying. But in this era, he could still hear well enough, but he had to really concentrate. And it also helped him to focus, to not have some of the distracting noises kind of impinging on his concentration, right? So one of the things that these stories are told about how Edison would use his hearing problems to excuse himself from participating in events, from excusing himself from dinner parties. I think that both of the wives, saw his first wife died very early in 1884 unexpectedly. He remarried a couple of years later with a woman he spent the rest of his life with. I think both wives found him difficult at times. He was too often spending his time in the laboratory. He liked to work overnight, as he had done as a telegrapher, and so oftentimes he would come home in the morning and go to sleep, right? His wives often would send dinner down from the house, knowing that he wasn't going to come home for dinner. Nonetheless, he found ways to spend time with them. With his first wife, they made visits to Florida together. His second wife and he bought a winter home in Fort Myers, actually, before he got remarried. And then later on, in the early part of the 20th century, they began to have regular winter vacations there. But Edison, I think, enjoyed the company of men more than he did sort of the social life of the household and of parties. And so he always found an excuse to spend time at the lab or elsewhere rather than at home. And so I think that was a difficult thing. And as a parent, I think he had high expectations for especially his sons, but expected them to kind of do it on their own. And so the sons from the first marriage were growing up in an era where, kind of making it on your own the way Edison had done was becoming more difficult, especially in technical fields where education was becoming increasingly important, as was true at Edison's laboratories. So increasingly the workforce, first at Menlo Park and then at his second lab, much larger lab in West Orange, most of them were college graduates. His sons had grown up not expecting to go to college. The second wife, her family, everybody went to college, and the sons were expected to go. The eldest, Thomas Alva Edison Jr., tried to be an inventor on his own and got taken advantage of for his name, never really succeeded. The second son, William Leslie, attended Yale for a year, didn't really like it, again tried to go off on his own, didn't succeed very well. The sons from the second marriage went to MIT and were much more successful. They also were raised by their own mother instead of a stepmother, and that made a difference. The daughter from the first marriage, after Edison's death, she had been his companion. So they'd gone together in 1884, about a month after Edison's first wife died. They went down to Philadelphia for a big electrical exhibition there. She accompanied him to other events that he did in New York. Edison loved to go to theater, and so with both wives he attended theater. He also attended theater with his daughter while they were in this period when before he remarried. And then after he remarried, the second marriage was to a younger woman who wasn't that much older than his daughter. And so there was a lot of conflict there, and she ended up going to Europe for education, sort of doing that tour of Europe, and then it ended up staying there, eventually marrying a German. She didn't come home until after World War I. The daughter from the second marriage went to Bryn Mawr. She actually wanted a career, but in this era, if you were the daughter of a wealthy man, and Edison was relatively wealthy, you didn't work. And so Edison didn't want her working. She ended up marrying a Catholic. The Edisons, although Edison was kind of irreligious, he believed in some kind of a greater intelligence, but whether it was a God in the sense we normally think of it is unclear. His second wife, though, was a staunch Methodist. Her father had founded the Chautauqua Institution, which was a Methodist summer camp for education and religion. Still exists today. She was much more religious. So they're both brought up in this American white Anglo-Saxon Protestant tradition of seeing the Catholic Church, right, as a threat. Especially in the U.S., are you going to be loyal to the Pope or to the country, right? And that was still a problem for politicians who were Catholic until John Kennedy became president, really. Joseph Biden is our second Catholic president. So they were very much opposed to this marriage, although the marriage did take place. So there were struggles with the children. And we know that Edison was a often absent father. When he was there, he liked to engage the children, but oftentimes he was engaging them in his work. So they would spend time in the library looking up stuff for him. But they also played games, although the stories that are told is that Edison didn't like to lose, which is a little problematic and not surprising. There are stories of, Edison loved the 4th of July. There are stories that the children told about how he would throw firecrackers at their feet. He was somebody who liked practical joking, and in that kind of male-dominated world of the telegraph and of the machine shop and of the laboratory, that was kind of standard. Maybe not so appropriate when you're enjoying the 4th of July with your children. So Edison was a difficult figure, I think, to be the son or daughter of or the wife of. You also had the problem of his fame, right? And so Edison couldn't go places without attracting crowds. In 1889, he went to the Paris Exposition. This is where the Eiffel Tower first appears for that exposition. Edison had the largest exhibit there, and this is also where his improved phonograph of 1888-89 made its appearance in Europe. Thousands of people listened to this new improved wax recording phonograph. And when Edison was walking around the exhibits, there were crowds. He couldn't even go out of his hotel without there being crowds there. So Edison is one of these people who's an early celebrity, right? He's famous for what he does, but in a sense he's becoming a celebrity. And I think that celebrity culture emerges at this time in part because of the newspapers, right? So you begin to get these feature stories on individuals like Edison and actors and other people that weren't so common in earlier eras. And Edison took advantage of this media to promote himself and his inventions. So Menlo Park was not much of a community. Most of the people in Menlo Park were actually Edison's workers. There was a little post office there. There was a small store. There wasn't much else. There were a few homes. And most of them were places where his workmen stayed. One of the people who came to Menlo Park was a woman named Sarah Jordan, who was related to Mary Edison's family. That's his first wife. And she set up a boarding house for some of the men. That boarding house still exists, but not in Menlo Park. By the 1920s, the Menlo Park laboratory had largely disappeared. It was just foundations. The glassblower shed was at the General Electric headquarters in Schenectady, which is where Edison had moved his machine shop to and built a big complex there that later became GE. The only thing that still existed here was the Sarah Jordan boarding house. That was moved to Dearborn, Michigan by Henry Ford, who then rebuilt the Menlo Park laboratory at his Greenfield Village connected to the Henry Ford Museum. You can go visit it today, a reproduction of the laboratory and the actual boarding house that was here at Menlo Park. But what was here by the 1920s was just the foundations of the buildings. So Edison, after Menlo Park, he was working for a while in New York. He actually has a laboratory in one of the manufacturing shops there that's building or making fixtures and meters and things like that. He decides after he remarries that he wants a new, bigger laboratory, and he and his second wife decide to move to West Orange, New Jersey. There's a kind of well-to-do gated community known as Llewellyn Park. They buy a fancy new house there. And there's property nearby where he builds a laboratory. So the West Orange Laboratory is built in 1887, opens at the very beginning of 1888. Edison staffs it with a large staff of machinists and experimenters, most of whom have college degrees. The experimenters do. And every kind of machine, electrical and chemical apparatus, a supply of chemicals. There are 4 small outbuildings, each 25 by 100. So 25 by 100, 2 stories. That was the Menlo Park Laboratory. He had the equivalent of 2 buildings equivalent to the Menlo Park lab in those 4 outbuildings. And then a huge main laboratory with 2 machine shops. Upstairs, a precision machine shop like his telegraph shops and like the original small machine shop at Menlo Park. And then a ground floor machine shop with heavy machinery. Edison said he could make anything from a railway locomotive to a lady's watch in these manufacturing shops. And in fact, he could do that. One of the things he actually worked on was electric railways. Here at Menlo Park, he built 2 experimental railways. He continued to experiment on electric railways at West Orange as well. Edison never commercialized railway technology. One of the people who became connected with his central station system in 1883-84, a guy named Frank Sprague, Edison asked him to join him in his laboratory, and Sprague said, "No, I want to be the guy who develops motor and railway technology," and he did. So Sprague is the guy who builds the first successful electric railway systems in the U.S. Unfortunately for him, the machinery is being made by the Edison Machine Works, and when Edison and some investors decide to combine all of the manufacturing shops that Edison and his staff had operated and owned, and the Edison Electric Light Company, and formed Edison General Electric, one of the things they did, they also took over the Sprague Company. And the name of the system got changed from Sprague to Edison. And Sprague was very upset about that and always harbored a grudge against Edison, in part because of that. So, you know, other people connected with Edison were always overshadowed by him. And motion pictures is one of those areas where the lead experimenter, a guy named William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, WKL Dixon, had joined the laboratory right at the beginning. Dixon had been hired as an electrical experimenter. He had actually worked for the Edison Company, but also he was a photographer. And so he became the staff photographer as well. And so a lot of the early photographs from the West Orange period were taken by Dixon. So in 1888, Edison when he opens the lab, he has a 4-page list of experimental projects, and he has enough men to work on most of them simultaneously, right? One of those projects, or several of those projects, I should say, involve the phonograph, right? And so the phonograph is one of the major projects at West Orange, as is electric light and power. The phonograph is improved dramatically. Edison actually was competing with a new phonograph that had been developed by Alexander Graham Bell and a guy named Charles Sumner Taylor, known as the graphophone. And so that's what spurred Edison to return to the phonograph. And Edison had the resources to build a much better machine and to improve the wax recording material. A guy named Jonas Aylesworth spent a year developing improved wax cylinders. But they were good enough by the spring, summer of 1888 to begin to commercialize this new improved phonograph that Edison and his workmen had devised, and his experimenters. So the phonograph begins to make a big splash. Edison attends a lecture and then invites to his laboratory a guy named Edward Muybridge. Muybridge is a noted photographer. He's most famous for a bet he made with Leland Stanford, the railroad magnate and the founder of Stanford College, and somebody who loved horse racing. They made a bet Stanford had made a bet that a horse's hooves leave the ground all at once. I think it was one or the other. They either leave the ground all at once or they don't. Muybridge actually figured out a way to snap a series of photographs successively to see what happens. And then he devised this circular projection system to have those succession of photographs revolve and project in a way that looked like motion pictures. And he did this with all sorts of other animals and human motion. And he became famous for this. And he gave a lecture on this. Edison invited him in the lab. They talked about combining Edison's phonograph with Muybridge's device. And then Edison thought to himself, oh, maybe I will try to invent a device that does for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear. And he thought about a cylinder on which you could put a series of small motion pictures to then revolve in a way that would again give you this perception of motion, right? Persistence of vision, that's what creates motion pictures. Each frame is an individual frame, but we see it as motion, right? So Edison comes up with this idea in October. He files a patent caveat. This is kind of a preliminary announcement that this is what he's working on. And that's where he says, I'm working on a device that does for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear. By the summer, fall, he had something that was closer to a motion picture device with strip film. And the person who's doing that experimental work is his photographer. Now, Edison is doing a lot of the design work of the mechanisms, but the photographic end of that's all Dickson, right? And so Dickson is very much a collaborator with Edison on motion pictures, and it takes them a while. They kind of return to it in '91 in a much more sustained way, and by '93 they have something that they can begin to publicly exhibit, although Edison had actually been giving interviews in which he'd been talking about this as early as 1890, right? Eventually they design what's known as the Kinetic Graph, which is the motion picture camera. Edison takes out the patent on that, and then the kinetoscope, which is a way of displaying the motion pictures. Edison did not project motion pictures. He had a wooden box with a viewing eyepiece you would look into, and a strip of film would play. They were very short. This is Edison's motion picture technology. It was a collaboration, a very important collaboration with William Dickson. And Dickson was really responsible for a lot of the day-to-day experimental work, and especially the photographic elements of it. Interestingly, Dickson and Edison have one joint patent. It's on an iron ore separator, which was another technology that Edison was working on that Dickson was very involved with. Dickson is not his co-inventor on motion pictures. And part of that probably has to do with the nature of the patent system at that time. Co-invention was more than just participating. You had to demonstrate equal intellectual contribution. And I think from Edison's perspective, the intellectual conception of the motion picture technology he saw as his, not as Dickson's. Whereas on this particular form of ore separator, which was actually a very important design, he saw Dickson as having kind of an equal participation in it. Later on, the patent in the mid-20th century, the patent system would be changed with the rise of industrial research laboratories after the era of Edison. When you have a lot of joint invention, a multitude of people working on a technology in a laboratory, to be more like scientific papers where everybody could be listed, right? But that wasn't true in the 19th century. So Dickson, who always credited Edison with motion pictures, even though he clearly played a crucial role, and it's hard to imagine the Edison's motion picture system being created without Dickson, right? But there's another element to motion pictures that's very striking in Edison's entire group of inventive activity. He never had a clear market for it. It was always kind of a novelty, even for Edison. And it's true that early motion pictures were all very short. They were mostly what were called actualities. That is, you take a motion picture and you film something. So there were a lot of vaudeville acts. You'd go into New York, you'd set your camera up, you'd just watch people walking by, or you'd put it next to a train and watch a train go by, right? You'd take it to Niagara Falls, you'd see something that most people didn't visit, right? Things like that. Then you begin to get story films, but they're very short. So the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, right? Which uses a little trick photography to actually have her beheaded. And you begin to get these kind of story films. The projection is something that people are beginning to work on. By the mid-1890s, Edison commercializes the system in 94, 95, and immediately people are trying to commercialize motion pictures. And there were people working on cameras before Edison who had filmed things but never really commercialized it. The Lumiere brothers in France devised a much simpler, less expensive camera. Edison's was electric, which also limited where you could use it. They had a hand crank camera. And not only that, it could be turned into a projector. And so the Lumieres are the first ones really to project, and other people begin to create projectors. The kinetoscope, and Dixon leaves to join a company known as Biograph, American Mutoscope and Biograph. And they also have a similar sort of viewing device. And these show up in train stations and bars and other places. You put a nickel in, you watch a film. Edison had actually done that with the phonograph for a while, these nickel and slot phonographs, sort of the first jukeboxes. And so that was the way in which motion pictures first made their entrance into public use, was as kind of these novelties, nickel and slot novelties. But increasingly with projection, right, motion pictures began to take on a new character. You begin to get more and more story films, multiple reel. So a guy named Edwin Porter joins the Edison company. Now it's striking that the Edison movie company is not the Edison movie company. Edison incorporates the motion picture division into an existing company called the Edison Manufacturing Company. They made batteries and things like fans and X-ray equipment and other things. Edison thought of motion pictures as another manufacturing product, right, rather than as an art form. And I think this is important. So while Porter was there, the Edison company was still one of the leaders. He did a wonderful, ingenious Jack and the Beanstalk, and then he made the first Western, The Great Train Robbery. It's probably the best known film of all the Edison films. They're story films. And then you begin to get the emergence of a film community in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Before Hollywood, there was Fort Lee. And why was it Fort Lee? It was right across the river from New York. New York, you had Broadway. You had people who knew how to tell stories on stage, then translate them into film. You had actors who would come across and act. You had a small community you could use as your prop. You had the Palisades, right? So the Perils of Pauline, a very famous serial series where Pauline was constantly in danger, and that was often filmed on the Palisades. Really, from the period of the early 20th century to the mid-teens, that's where the motion picture industry was mostly congregated. Yeah, there were other places, Chicago and other places where filming took place. Hollywood emerges because of the promotion of the Los Angeles area. Cheap land, the sun shines all day, and light is the most important thing for the motion pictures. And I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, a suburb of LA. You can get to mountains, snow, desert, ocean. You had a city, all of that stuff, orange groves, other farms, all that stuff within about 2 hours. So you all of a sudden had a place where there was sunshine all the time, you had cheap land to build lots on, and you had any kind of environment that you needed to tell a story with. And so they all begin to move out to Hollywood. Well, so the story that Hollywood tells is that they were trying to get away from Edison's goons who were breaking up their equipment. So the Motion Picture Patents Company had been formed in 1908. Edison's lawyer, Frank Dyer, had come up with this brilliant idea. He joined together all the manufacturers, including George Eastman, who provided the film stock. In fact, it was experimental work that Eastman was doing that led to the strip kinetoscope. you combine them all, and that means that people can't make movies. Well, in fact, that didn't happen. They couldn't really prevent them from making movies. But what they did was they sent sort of detectives out to Fort Lee to find out what equipment they were using in order to sue them. It was never very effective. And then the government filed antitrust, and by 1915, the Motion Picture Patents Company was gone. So Fort Lee was still the center of motion picture production during the lifespan of the Motion Picture Patents Company, right? So it wasn't because of that they moved out to Hollywood, although that's the story that Hollywood likes to tell of itself, is that they were escaping Edison's goons, but in fact that wasn't the case at all.